Hey pals, so just experimenting with some ways to deliver you some premium content. Uh, so this is going to be like a little thing about the final sequence of Beast of the Southern Wild. So one of the key things to remember for this sequence is that we're going to look at it from two different ideological perspectives. We're going to look at it from the one we have been doing, Sing for No Country, which is socio-political perspective. Okay, so we're going to examine the final sequence in that respect. We're also going to look at it from a kind of coming of age, adolescence perspective as well, to see if we can read the same scene in two different ways, and this will help us when we're kind of providing an argument and a counter argument for our essays. So the final sequence starts in the Elysian Fields place. Remember what we said about Elysian Fields. So Elysian Fields is a reference to Greek mythology. It's a place where the heroic and the virtuous go to rest in their final resting place, like the afterlife in kind of Greek mythology. And so what the implication is, well, there's a couple of implications. The first implication is that this isn't real, that this isn't taking place in a conscious reality, in Hush Puppy's actual reality, that this is a kind of symbolic thing, that this is a representation of something. And also it implies something about her mother, okay, that if her mother is here, this is where her mother has gone to, then the implication is that she is heroic and virtuous in some kind of way. So I want you to think about it in a similar way to the way that we thought about Ophelia and the fantasy world in Pan's Labyrinth, which is that the fantasy world is a manifestation of what's going on inside Ophelia. We know that the fantasy world isn't real, and we read it as a kind of the adolescence that and the changes that are going on in her body and in her head, etc., etc. And I think this Elysian Field sequence is the same for Hush Puppy, and I think it's almost Freudian in the sense that, if you remember when we did Vertigo, we talked about that idea about how in order to become an adult, you have to first let go or reject the figure of the mother. Well, that kind of what is happening here, which is Hush Puppy is saying goodbye to her mother. She's kind of reckoning with something. She's reckoning with the fact that her mother abandoned her, the fact that her mother isn't there anymore, the fact that her mother is associated with her childhood, and Hush Puppy at this moment says goodbye and then moves forward to kind of do something. So it's almost as like this scene is symbolic of her saying goodbye to her childhood and letting go of the trauma of the abandonment of her mother in that sense. And if you think about the way that the scene looks, so I want you to think about the mise-en-scène, I want you to think about the colour palette, I want you to think about the lighting, I want you to think about the lenses, right? Because it's so warm and orange and beautiful to look at. You've got all of those fairy lights within the composition, fairy lights there as props as well. So it creates this real warm glow, and I think that's meant to symbolise the kind of affection, the way she feels about her mother, okay? And then you've got the kind of the use of those very kind of like long lenses to create this kind of soft, kind of gentle glow around everything. Combine that with the diegetic sound of the jazz music, which is very soft and gentle, and she's in this like womb-like environment with her mother, and then she has to go back to the harsh reality. When she turns to kind of like run after she said goodbye to her mother, we get what we call, or we get a harsh cut, so a straight cut in terms of our editing, but it's also what we call a graphic match in terms of the composition. So it's slightly different to an action match. Action match is where, as we know, it's continuity editing, so it's all within the same space. Somebody reaches out in a wide shot to grab, these weird clogs. I'll put the clogs there. So someone reaches out in a wide shot to grab the clogs, and then it cuts to a close-up of the clogs being grabbed or whatever. So that's all within the same space. Graphic match, slightly different. Okay, so Hush Puppy turns to run, and it matches her action, but it cuts to her in an entirely different place, running. So it's called a graphic match instead, and it helps bridge the gap between those two things, but it's further evidence that this hasn't been happening. Because how does she get back? It doesn't explain that. It's an ellipsis. The graphic match covers the ellipsis, and it indicates to us that she was never there anyway. Now she's back in her community, okay? The non-diegetic score changes at this point to match the action also, so it becomes more propulsive, more full of momentum. This is mimicked or matched by the facial expressions, the physicality, the body language of the four girls who are walking kind of aggressively with purpose across the land. Okay, so you've got performance in there, you've got the graphic match, you've got editing. The cinematography and the composition places Hush Puppy at the center of the frame. It indicates her importance as a kind of leader, as a kind of leader of her community, but these girls at this point as well. And then you've got, think about the grain, think about the film. You've got the kind of that 16mm grain, which adds this kind of magic to it, this magic quality, but it's also handheld, verite style, kind of documentary style camera work, which grounds it back into reality. It's what gives the film this kind of magic realism, okay? These combinations of different things. So notice as well how the non-diegetic score is constantly anchoring our emotions all the time. So when it cuts to Wink looking at Hush Puppy as she's kind of dealing with the aurochs, sorry, it's just slightly before that when it cuts to Wink and he's on his deathbed, it kind of completely quietens down, gets rid of a lot of the instruments, a lot of the instrumentation. We've just got these low strings. So we are being told how to feel all the time. So whereas it was very propulsive and full of momentum a second ago when Hush Puppy and the girls were striding across the land, now it's quieter and we understand that we're supposed to feel sad. So it really does guide us constantly through our different emotions. The CGI as well, special effects. So you could talk about that as in post-production and editing. You can talk about special effects and the CGI within the mise-en-scène. It's up to you. But the idea that they exaggerate the size of the aurochs in comparison to Hush Puppy to kind of create this kind of like the symbolism of them, what they represent and how much they represent, how significant and important they are in terms of what they represent. And then think about Hush Puppy as well. When they come up in the distance, 50mm lens, okay, so that we can focus on Hush Puppy. The background is shallow, but we can still see the aurochs come in. All of the other girls' performances contrast to Hush Puppy. So Hush Puppy remains defiant, still, facial expression of determination, strong-willed and kind of like focused and stoic. Whereas the other three girls, they kind of scream, high-pitched screams. Their body language becomes fearful and afraid. They run away. Hush Puppy doesn't do that, okay? And then when they bow to Hush Puppy, that composition again, it indicates to us that she is perhaps a symbol of something, that she represents something. Just want to talk about two lines of dialogue now. So diegetic dialogue, okay? You've got you're my friend kind of, and I got to take care of mine. There are 2 lines of dialogue that Hush Puppy says to the aurochs, and I think these are really important in terms of how we interpret them depending on the framework or the perspective that we are using, right? So we've got to just think about representation for a second, okay? If we look at this from a socio-political perspective, then what are the aurochs? Okay, they are literal warnings from the past. It is the environment, the past environment that has kind of has come back to life, unfrozen, and come to warn us or come to seek vengeance for what we have done. Something along those lines. That's what they are. There's 4 of them, almost like in terms of this environmental catastrophe, like the whole 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And here they are back to kind of ask us questions about our treatment of the earth in that kind of sense, right? So the aurochs are a kind of literal warning from the past. They are unfrozen from the last time there was a climate catastrophe, the Ice Age, and now here they are as a kind of warning to us about what we're about to do, right? So we can look at it from that perspective, from this kind of socio-political perspective about the environment. And if you think about Hush Puppy, right, her mother, the most obvious kind of idea about this mother who has abandoned us to kind of go to this kind of heroic, virtuous place and forget about us, the obvious kind of metaphor there is Mother Nature, that the mother is Mother Nature and that we have been abandoned by Mother Nature because of our treatment of the earth, okay? And Wink, the father, is the earth now, a kind of volatile, combustible, kind of aggressive force that's on the verge of collapse. That's what Wink is. That's why maybe explains why he's so violent, why he's so chaotic, because the world is spinning out of control now that it's been abandoned by Mother Nature, who was kind of keeping everything in balance. But now we have a new balance, the balance between the mother and the father, and that's Hush Puppy. So Hush Puppy represents this kind of hope for the future, this kind of new possibility for the future. So when she says, "You're my friend," kind of, she's kind of making peace with the past. She's making peace with the environment. She's acknowledging the mistakes of the past. And then she says, "But I got to take care of mine." And it's that idea that she now needs to kind of move on. Okay, she kind of acknowledges what's gone on, and now she's going to lead forward. So from a socio-political perspective, those two lines of dialogue make a lot of sense. But we can also look at this from a kind of different perspective, a different ideological perspective, which is a coming of age perspective, right? And the same sequence, the same two lines of dialogue then change, because if we look at it from a coming of age or an adolescence kind of perspective, what we see is "You're my friend," kind of, is her making peace with the past. I mean, that's what the Oryx are. They're literally creatures from the past. And we've just seen her say goodbye to her mother and kind of make amends with that. So it's this idea that she's facing her childhood, which is now in the past. She's facing the memories of her mother, the abandonment of her mother, which is now in the past, the way that she's been treated by her father in this kind of loving but still volatile way. And she's saying, "You're my friend," kind of. I make peace with this. It's part of who I am, okay? But then she says, "I got to take care of mine." And that's the idea that she's now moving forward. She's having to grow up too soon. She's grown up too soon into adolescence, into this kind of like, into this grown-up kind of state of mind, because she has to. Her father's about to die, the catastrophe is coming, she has to lead her community and lead herself forward. So that's kind of what this is in that sense. It can also be read in that way too. Get that really tender, really emotional sequence between Wink and Hush Puppy as she says goodbye and Wink dies. And what's really interesting about the scene in general from a narrative perspective is that it mirrors the opening sequence directly, except everything is kind of reversed. So in the opening sequence, when Wink yells feed up time," and then he feeds Hush Puppy, which is the right way around. The father feeds the daughter, the parent feeds the child. It's about nurturing. Here, that's completely reversed. And it's again to indicate the fact that Hush Puppy is growing up, or from a socio-political perspective, that she's now hope for the future and hope for the community, okay? So she's now literally feeding her father. So feed up time has kind of been reversed in that sense. So whether we look at it from a socio-political perspective, and she's now the nurturer, she's now becoming this kind of Mother Nature balance, restorative figure, or we look at it from an adolescence perspective, she's now growing up and feeding her father. It works either way. The diegetic sound of the heartbeat that she listens to as Wink passes away is again a mirror of the opening sequence when she listens to the sound of the bird. I think the bird's heartbeat and the pig's heartbeat, and she's kind of, again, it's about her being in tune with nature. She is at one with nature all the way through. When the ice caps melt and they cut to thousands of miles away and the ice caps are melting, suddenly she looks and she sees them, and then it goes back. So it's this idea that she's in tune with nature, that she can hear these heartbeats, that she can hear the ice caps melting, that she understands nature. She's kind of becoming Mother Nature in that sense. So it works from that kind of perspective, and that's where the diegetic sound of the heartbeat comes into it. The scene is intensely emotional as well. So if you remove all of the ideological perspectives, the sequence purely works as an emotional piece of cinema. It's full of close-ups, it's full of extreme close-ups. The non-diegetic score actively mirrors the way that we're supposed to be feeling, the way that Hush Puppy feels, because remember, our narrative perspective, we're positioned as Hush Puppy, so the music tells us how she is feeling, and then we respond in the same way. Okay, so it's highly emotional sequence regardless of ideology. Then we get the wide shot of Wink's body being kind of pushed, set on fire and pushed away to sea. And this is another reference to Greek mythology, so it ties in with the Elysian fields, and it places her parents as these kind of mythological figures, both of them now existing in a kind of mythological space. So they're representations, they're symbols of, in this case, kind of like Earth as it was, Earth as it is, kind of chaotic and violent, and the Mother Nature, which has abandoned us, and Hush Puppy now this restorative force in the centre of these things, okay? You get this shot, kind of like with a 50mm lens from behind the boat. The kind of flames are coming up here in the composition. Hush Puppy is 50mm behind. We could still focus on her. She becomes one with the fire and one with elements, and it again indicates her elemental nature, that she's part of nature in some kind of way. She's connected to nature because of that, because the composition frames her in that way. And then the community who are there kind of like say this diegetic dialogue, and they shout, "Here she comes." And at the moment that they shout, "Here she comes," as part of the poem that they're saying, it then harsh cuts to a low angle close up of Hush Puppy, very stern facial expression and body language, literally looking up to her. The indication being, here she comes is, here's the hope for the future. Here she is, the balance. So it works from a socio-political perspective in terms of that. And then let's talk about the final shot of the film, which is this kind of wide shot, 50mm lens kind of composition, tracking backwards with momentum. Hush Puppy is framed in the centre in terms of the composition, and the community kind of are built around her. So she is now firmly like the centre of her community in that sense. The camera tracking backwards away from her, almost at her power, almost kind of moving back from her because she's got such momentum, indicates her as this kind of, again, this leader figure. Okay, she becomes, it's kind of a biblical image, I think, on purpose, because the obvious reference is Moses leading the parting of the Red Sea, the idea of kind of like the leading the people through to safety, leading his people through to safety. And that's kind of what Hush Puppy is here. If you think about costume design within the mise-en-scène, the kind of white flowing robe, the fact that she's literally almost kind of gliding on water, the parting of the water on either side of the composition kind of positions her as a biblical, mythical figure again. Now she is this leader, she is this hope in that sense, and the camera is at a low angle again, looking up towards her literally, so we as the audience look up towards her as well. And it's now to us to decide whether that final image is a bleak one or a hopeful one. And there's different ways for you to read it, because it's bleak in the sense that the colour palette is very grey and bleak. The water kind of like rising, as she said it would do in the opening, kind of non-diegetic voiceover, in on both sides. It's kind of claustrophobic in that sense, the kind of oncoming environment catastrophe. Or you can look at it as... weird cut there because I got totally interrupted, but that's the bleak version. The hopeful version is that she's positioned as a saviour figure, that she's moving forward with momentum, that she's going to kind of restore balance to the environment. It's also powerfully feminist if you look at it from that perspective, because it's the idea that as a kind of like, now that she's kind of had to grow up, she's now becoming this kind of a woman, she's a girl. It's the idea of the future being female, the idea of a kind of feminist uprising as well, that she's leading forward. It's no longer a patriarchal force of Wink. Wink was destructive. The patriarchy has been massively destructive for the environment, whereas here we now have a female leader taking us forward, that there's hope and there's positivity. So it depends on how you want to read that ending. Okay. All right, so that's the end of this. It may be terrible, it might work. We'll see how it goes, see if you like it. Bye!